Hello. Welcome to today's webinar on plans for companies that don't qualify for HMRC recognised plans. I think we've got a good number of attendees logged in, so I am just going to start straight away. This presentation is going to last approximately 30 minutes, and the level it's pitched at is to give familiarity with the plans that don't qualify for HMRC recognition. I'm going to deliver the absolute basics, and I am going to give a very high level basic summary of the tax treatment, give a flavour of how all of these things work rather than the detailed tax treatment. On the agenda for today is when is a non-HMRC recognised plan useful? What's the point of an HMRC recognised plan? And therefore, what are we trying to replicate with a non-HMRC recognised plan? The key types of plan, how they compare, and share plan fundamentals. So all the other things around setting up a share plan are still applicable to these types of plans, and how you go through them. Let's have a talk about when a non-recognised plan is useful, and there tends to be three types of scenario. First, where the company doesn't qualify for an HMRC recognised plan. Second is when employees qualify, and the third is where the HMRC plans aren't flexible enough. In the first category, the typical problems are that the company has too many employees. So say for an EMI plan, there's a limit of 250 employees. Company might have an excluded trade. So the one we tend to find problematic most of the time is where the company has financial services activities. You may have too much in the way of assets. It may not be independent, so that's typical for private equity-backed companies, or it might not have a UK permanent establishment. The lack of a permanent establishment might sound an odd one, but it's one I'm seeing more and more with startups. So startups come to London for the talent, for the advisors, but they actually might not. They might be trading out of another country and actually have a lot of their substance outside of the country. The circumstances where employees might be non-qualifying is if they're not UK taxpayers. So, an EMI plan or CSOP or SIP just isn't of any benefit to them. They don't meet the working time requirements for an EMI plan, or they've got a material interest or had a material interest, meaning they don't qualify. The last categories are a little bit more rare. It is very common to bump up against the restrictions on HMRC plans, but what we tend to do there is where an HMRC plan is too restrictive, we do an HMRC recognised plan alongside a non-recognised plan, so we can maximise the benefits of the HMRC plan and also give rewards outside of it if there needs to be a top-up beyond what the HMRC plans allow. I want to have a think about, fundamentally, what is the point of an approved plan? And to my mind, this is about getting tax treatment in the same way as if you'd made an investment. So that means capital gains tax treatment that's taxed at somewhere between 0 and 20%. That favourable tax treatment is a reward for taking risk. And the bit of magic that HMRC recognised plans has is that if you do something under an HMRC recognised plan, you'll get the reward of the favourable tax treatment without actually having to take the risk up front. So a slightly different way of putting it is to say that the point of an approved plan is you get the reward of a low tax rate for taking a risk, but you can avoid taking the risk by waiting and seeing before you pay up front, or you don't have to pay much up front in the first place. I want to see how that works in the context of a few of the approved plans. And I have to apologize, in order to give the flavor of how this works, I'm really probably oversimplifying the structure of these plans and the tax treatment. But for a share incentive plan, the way this could work is that you broadly pay £900, you receive £9,000 worth of shares, and if you hold those shares for 3 years, the growth in value is taxed as a gain on investment, so capital gains tax. You've avoided the risk because even if those shares decline by 80 or 90% in value, you would still break even. So you're not really, although you have paid something up front, you're not really taking on the full amount of risk had you bought those shares outside of an HMRC recognised plan. Another type of plan, probably the commonest HMRC recognised plan, is enterprise management incentive. And the great thing about an option is that it allows you to lock in a purchase price at the outset, but wait and see whether you want to pay that purchase price, whether you actually want to buy the shares. So the typical way EMI options work is that people are granted them early on in the life of the company, but they don't exercise those options until immediately before a sale. So they don't ever have to pay that exercise price until the employees know that they're going to get real value on them. So here, let's say they've received an option in year 1. They pay the exercise price in year 5 just before they're sold, but still at year 1's price. The growth in value on those shares is still taxed as a gain on investment, so capital gains tax. You've avoided the risk there by waiting and seeing to see if the share is a good bet. The JSOP works in a similar way. So it's an option, the exercise price is set at the start, you get to wait and see whether you actually want to pay that exercise price. Let's go through some worked examples. And I've really done quite a lot to simplify the tax treatment. So if you just buy shares, and this applies to employees or non-employees, if you buy shares in year 1 for, say, £1,000 and sell those shares in year 5 for £30,000, you'd have a gain of £29,000. That gain should all be treated as a gain on investment, so capital gains tax, and everyone gets a tax-free allowance. At the moment it's £11,300. That's tax-free. Peculiar to employees who have above 5% shareholding, they might be eligible for a 10% tax rate on those capital gains. So the next £11,700 of their gain is at 10%. That results in an effective tax rate of 6%, which is very favourable. Let's have a look at a USOP, and that stands for an unapproved share option plan. So an option without tax relief. If an employee received an option in year 1 with an exercise price of £1,000, and then in year 5 they pay the exercise price of £1,000 and then immediately sell the shares, then they have a gain of £29,000. So in many ways, this is very similar to the share purchase. Purchase price was the same, sale price was the same, gain is the same. The only difference is that the person with the option has been able to wait and see whether to pay that purchase price. That flexibility of being able to wait and see has a very different tax consequence. There's a mistake on the slide there. There isn't a tax-free band, so the entire amount is taxed at 42%. So the individual only receives £16,000 net of tax, and the effective tax rate is 42%. So substantially higher than share purchase. Now, if you look at an EMI option, commercially it's the same as the unapproved share option. So receive it in year 1 with the exercise price of 1,000. In year 5, when you know you're going to sell it, you pay the exercise price of 1,000. There's a gain of 29,000, but you get a favourable tax rate of 10% above the annual exemption. So you get that same very low tax rate. Here it's an effective tax rate of 6%. The magic of an EMI plan is it allows you to have your cake and eat it. It gives you the tax treatment of the share purchase with the flexibility of an option. Let's just do a quick compare. Share purchase, you have to pay up front, but there's a low effective tax rate. The USOP, you don't have to pay up front, but the penalty for that is that you have a high effective tax rate. With an EMI, you get the best of both worlds. You can wait and see on the purchase price, but you get the great tax rate. That effective tax rate of 6% is just limited to the example here. If the amounts were different, the effective tax rate would be different, but still very low and favourable. So here's the meat of this presentation, and it's how can we replicate that situation without using an HMRC recognised plan and the tax reliefs to go with it? Well, can the outside of HMRC recognised plans, can an employee get investment tax treatment or capital gains tax treatment? Absolutely, if they buy the shares for the full price. Often that's going to be expensive. Can the employee wait and see on the purchase price? Yes, they can, but if you do it that way, you turn it into an unapproved share option plan, and you have to pay the tax, the high tax. So can we be a bit cleverer? Can the employee pay a small amount for something that delivers exactly the same growth as a normal share and still get the investment tax treatment? And the answer is yes. They can buy growth shares or JSOP units. And they're special types of asset that should have a low valuation up front, but have the great treatment. The alternative is, can we set something up where the employee can wait and see on the purchase price and still get investment tax treatment? And the answer is yes, through something called a deferred share purchase plan. Let's go through growth shares and JSOP units. And if we go back to the fundamental of what a share is almost just a contractual right, and the nature of those rights are set out in the company's articles of association. Those rights are typically made up of what a shareholder can vote, what dividends they can get, and what they can get in terms of a capital distribution. And you have a huge amount of flexibility as to how you structure those three rights, and it's just a matter of delving into the articles and amending them. So you can say, you can attach any kind of terms and conditions to those voting dividend rights and capital gains rights that you want. In order to create a growth share, we can dive into the articles and say, okay, let's forget the voting rights and the dividend rights, let's concentrate on the capital rights. And in the case of an ordinary share, the capital rights are simply, if there's a capital event, such as a capital distribution or a sale of the shares, split the proceeds equally between shareholders. Alternatively, you could say, don't split the proceeds between shareholders evenly. For a class of growth shareholders, let's split the proceeds so that these growth shareholders only get the increase in value on the shares. The idea of doing that is, if they're only going to get the increase in value from today they're not really worth that much. So you should be able to buy them for a low price. When it comes to selling them, they should be able to be sold for the same increase on the value of an ordinary share. So if we go to an example here, what I'm trying to show in the diagrams is on the left-hand axis, you have share value, on the right you have time. So at the left-hand side of each chart is early on in the company's history, and let's say an employee buys a growth share for, on the left-hand side it's the purchase of ordinary shares. So let's say an employee bought the shares for £5 and sold the shares for £17, so a profit of £12. On the right-hand side, if the employee purchased the same, almost the same shares in the same company, in the same circumstances, but rather than buying ordinary shares, bought growth shares or JSOP units, then they buy a growth share for a very, very low value, let's say it's a penny, and they can sell the growth in value on that share for £12. So in many ways, they're in a very similar position to what they would have been if they bought an ordinary share, that they've had the same growth in value of £12. The difference is that the purchase, when they bought the ordinary share, they had to pay £5. For the growth shares, they only had to pay a penny. So trying to create a growth share or a JSOP unit is all about trying to get that low value up front, but delivering the whole value or all of the growth in value on an exit. So in order to construct growth shares, we need to amend the articles so that it doesn't have any value up front but does on an exit. A JSOP unit is a lot more complicated in principle, but delivers exactly the same economic treatment. It has a low value up front with a value that represents the growth in value on ordinary shares on an exit. The JSOP stands for a joint share ownership plan. And the way it works is that an employee enters into an agreement with a trust, and the employee and the trustee jointly purchases an ordinary share. The terms of the agreement between the employee and the trust allocates the gains such that the trustee will always get the existing value or the original value, and the employee will only get the growth in value. So when it comes around to the employee or the employee and the trustee selling the share, they sell it for the full price, so £17 per share. The employer receives only the growth in value, and the trustee receives the original value of £5. So from the employee's perspective, they've got exactly the same amount of growth as if they bought a growth share or even an ordinary share, but they've paid a low amount up front. And also the great thing is, for a JSOP unit, as much as a growth share, as much as an ordinary share, that growth in value is growth on investment and is subject to capital gains tax. Let's have a little bit of a talk about a deferred share purchase plan. There are a few different ways to structure a deferred share purchase plan, but the idea is that the employee is buying an ordinary share and they are giving full value up front. But what's different is the way in which they're giving the full value for the share up front. They pay a very small amount, and the remainder takes the form of a future commitment to pay that value. That could either be in the form of an interest-free loan, could be an interest-bearing loan, or it could be something that's allowed under a quirk of companies law that means if you don't pay the full subscription price for a share, it remains something outstanding that the company can call on. This means that up front, the employee still pays a low amount, let's say it's a penny, for a a share that will deliver a growth in value at the end. So when it comes to an exit, the employee sells the full share, the full ordinary share, for £17 and uses £4.99 to repay the outstanding commitment. The great thing about this, again, is that this has the ordinary tax treatment on an investment, and the individual has largely avoided the risk by not having to pay the full amount. The difference with between a deferred share purchase plan and a growth share plan or a JSOP is that the employee is bound by that commitment to pay the outstanding balance. So in an insolvency situation, there's a little bit of a sting in the tail of this, in that the employee could be required to pay the outstanding amount and not get anything worth for it. But still, the fundamental of a deferred share purchase plan is that the employee can benefit from the growth in value subject to capital gains tax, with the amount they have to put up front being affordable. So let's go through, as a reminder of what we talked about, and just compare restricted shares, unapproved share option plans, growth shares, joint share ownership plans, and deferred share purchase plans. Certainly growth shares, JSOPs and DSBPs are all ways of trying to achieve a similar thing, but they have different implications in terms of the complexity of setting them up, the risk for the employee, and if you're comparing it with a USOP, the tax treatment. So the easiest thing to set up is a restricted share. And what I mean by a restricted share is an ordinary share where if the individual is a bad leaver, you can take those shares off them. Because they're an ordinary share, there's the potential for there to be a large upfront payment. It might happen that the company is at an early stage and so the full value of the share is still very low. So this might be an option. You get the great capital gains tax treatment. It's simple because it's an ordinary share, so you don't need to delve into the articles. It doesn't require a trust to operate. There is downside risk, but the downside risk is limited to the amount that you paid up front. Let's go through an unapproved share option plan. So there isn't any large upfront payment. You have to pay an exercise price in order to get the shares, but you can decide if and when to pay that. But there isn't capital gains tax on growth. But it is simple, so you don't need to restructure the share capital of the company. It doesn't need a trustee to operate, and there isn't downside risk. If we look at growth shares, because they're only an entitlement to growth in value up front, they have a low value, so don't require a large upfront payment. They do receive capital gains tax on the growth. Where they get complicated is that you do need to delve into the Articles of Association to set up the capital rights in such a way that the individual only gets the growth in value. But it doesn't require the trustee to operate, so there isn't the expense of that, and there isn't a downside risk. If the value of the company drops below the hurdle attached to the growth shares, the individual doesn't have to pay anything out. A joint share ownership plan. Again, very similar to growth shares. There isn't a large upfront payment. There is capital gains tax on the growth. Probably the benefit is that it doesn't require a restructuring of the share capital, but the flip side is it does require a trustee to operate. So the complexity that would have gone into the Articles of Association with a growth share instead has been put in the agreement between the trustee and the employee. But there isn't a downside risk, at least for the employee. Because there was that agreement between the employee and the trustee, where the trustee was receiving the benefit of the existing value, If the price of the share drops, then it's the trustee rather than the employee who loses out. Finally, you have a deferred share purchase plan. There's no large upfront payment, although you are making that commitment to pay in the future. There is capital gains tax treatment on the growth in value, but it doesn't require restructuring of the share capital, doesn't require a trustee to operate. And the sting in the tail for a DSPP is that there is the potential for downside risk. So in order to go through the decision-making process, you need to have a look at your company, at your resources, about your shareholders, and think which of these are most important. If you need to do something quickly and simply that doesn't require any complexity around restructuring the share capital, setting up a trust, or the arrangements around DSPP, a USOP will work. A USOP will align the incentives of an employee with the company. It's just not as tax efficient. If that tax efficiency is important, then my starting point would always be growth shares. It's probably simpler and cheaper to set up than a JSOP or a DSPP. The circumstances in which growth shares are less favourable is when you don't want to go through the restructuring of the share capital. And that might be because you have a whole load of existing investors, or you might even be a listed company, and restructuring the share capital might not be approved by your investors, or it may just be a two-time an arrangement that takes too much time and too much expense. So if restructuring the share capital is too much, then you should look at a JSOP or a DSPP. If it's a relatively stable company where there isn't risk, then probably a DSPP would be the way to go. If there is some downside risk that you would like to protect employees from, then a JSOP is probably going to be the way to go. So, what's the process in setting up any of these plans? Well, the first thing is you shouldn't let the tax tail wag the commercial or motivational dog. So you need to think, first and foremost, this is about recruiting, motivating, and retaining your employees. So what are the fundamentals of the plan that need to deliver that? And that's the same whether it's an HMRC recognised plan or not an HMRC recognised plan. So you need to think about the total allocation of equity to employees as a whole, the individual allocations or performance conditions you're going to attach, and then the treatment of leavers. Once you've designed those fundamentals, the most important point here is then what's the valuation of the shares? Because that's going to indicate whether maybe restricted shares would be affordable for your employees, in which case you don't need to go through the complexity of JSOPs, growth shares, or a DSPP. A valuation is a process in the employee share schemes world that's particular to the that has a particular tax treatment or a particular approach under the tax rules. Often the tax valuation is significantly lower than a valuation for other purposes, particularly for fundraising purposes. So as an example, in the startup scenario, it's very common to see startups getting a valuation of 3, 5, or even 10 million with very little in the way of profits or maybe even revenue. So for tax purposes, that startup would possibly have a zero valuation, even though they've gone out and raised funds or are planning to raise funds at a far higher valuation. So for this kind of plan, valuation becomes incredibly important. There's also another aspect to valuation that's different with an HMRC recognised plan and non-recognised plans. That's for EMI plans in particular. You can agree the valuation with HMRC. You can't with non-recognised plans. There's an extra sting in the tail in that there's been some recent case law on valuation which has indicated that HMRC are expecting people to be quite thorough in looking for comparable companies in order to base that valuation on. But at the same time, HMRC are accepting and approving valuations under the EMI schemes that aren't as thorough. So we have a little bit of a difficulty in that what HMRC are accepting for valuations for HMRC recognised plans are not necessarily the same as what they're accepting outside. So let's say you've designed the plan fundamentals, you have your valuation. You then need to go through the thought process of which of the non-recognised plans are appropriate for your company, for your employees, for your circumstances. You then need to appoint an advisor to create the documentation. So for a growth share plan, that means going into the articles and creating the documents to amend those articles. You need a subscription agreement for the individual and ancillary documents to go with that and to get approval from the board and shareholders. With a JSOP, the additional documents are you need an agreement between the trustee and the employee, and you also need all the documents to set up the trust itself. A deferred share purchase plan is a little bit simpler. You don't need to make amendments to the articles necessarily. You don't need to set up a trust. You don't need an agreement with a trust. So all you need is the document that allows the individual to have the right to buy the shares and sets out the nature and terms of their future commitment to pay the purchase price. Once you have all those documents together, you can hand those out to employees to sign, and you have created the award. So that is it. I realise it's been a little bit of a basic overview, but I hope that's been useful to give you a flavour of what's currently out there. I'm conscious that there are some more exotic planning opportunities out there, which I haven't gone into. Probably two of the more common ones are in the context of partnerships and in the context of private equity-backed companies. And my thoughts there are, if those plans are appropriate, you'll know because your investors will have those discussions with you. So I don't think you're particularly missing out by not thinking through those plans. The plans that I've presented today are the ones where HMRC are aware of them, and they don't have HMRC approval, but they don't constitute, in our view, aggressive tax planning. So they are very legitimate and in common use. I'm now going to see if anyone has questions. The way to answer questions is through the GoToWebinar interface. You can type them in, and I will attempt to answer them. So I will leave it for a few minutes just to see if anyone would like to ask any questions. Okay, So the first question is, can you please explain again the CGT position in relation to the USOP? I can, and I will see if I can go back to the relevant slide as well. So I have simplified things quite a lot on the USOP. I'm assuming that when an option is exercised, the shares are sold immediately. That's not always the case. So let's say the USOP is granted when the shares are worth £5, so there's a £5 exercise price, and then the option is exercised when the shares are worth £10, so that there is a £5 gain, which is subject to income tax and national insurance contributions at high rates, but then the shares aren't sold until there's a further gain of £10. That further gain between the time of exercise and selling the shares would be subject to capital gains tax. So capital gains tax can apply in the context of an unapproved share option plan. Now, I am a little bit guilty of oversimplifying it there. The reason why I think that simplification is fair is my understanding it's very, very rare for people to exercise early before selling the shares. So in the way that a USOP is going to play out, basically all the gain is going to be treated as subject to income tax and national insurance contributions. So hope that clears up the question. Okay, don't think we're going to get any other questions, so I hope that's been a useful overview, and thank you very much for your time. Going to end the webinar there.